Well, let me just say first, the first part of your question, or one of them, is that why at this time? Perhaps I need to remind the national community that in the budget statement of 2008-2009, when oil was trading at over $140 and gas at about $11, it is that in that budget statement, there's a whole piece on tax and on the property tax reform. And in fact, I have the budget speech in front of me, and the last sentence in that section on the property tax actually stated as follows, and I will just read it out. There's a whole section on it, and we spoke about it, and it says that the proposed new property tax regime will take effect from January 1st, 2010. We gave some details of the system and so on, so that's the answer to that question. With regard to the broader question about what was the thinking behind it, well, it's a question of reforming the system. As it is now, there's a lot of inequity in the system, and when I say that, within this small country of Trinidad and Tobago, we find that persons living in certain areas are paying much higher taxes, property taxes, than others. And the reason is because we have two pieces of legislation sitting side by side being administered at the same time. The land and building taxes, which goes back to 1920, and in municipal corporations legislation. So for instance, you have in Shoguanas, you have persons paying at 10%, but at the old rates, the old land and building tax rate, which is about going back to valuations going back to 1948. But you have in San Fernando, persons paying 8% on 2004 valuations. You have persons in, I believe, in Arima paying 10% on about 2004 valuations. And the rest of the country, with the exception of Arima, San Fernando, Shoguanas, I think Point Fortin and Port of Spain is 10% at 1975 valuations. You have the rest of the country paying taxes based on $10 of 1 acre of land, regardless of where the land is situated, and 7.5% on the valuation of the property. So I can tell you right then and there, you are seeing the anomalies within the system. So what the system intended to do, remove all of that. Every house owner of residential property in Trinidad and Tobago will be paying the flat rate of 3%, but of course is based on the assessed value of your property. So that's one of the things. Remove the inequities, remove the anomalies, and so that we bring equity and a sense of consistency in the system.
Having said that, is it that some areas will see a reduction in taxes?
Yes, I think a lot of times we focus on what it will mean in terms of some areas and seeing an increase. Because of the same reason that I just indicated, one clear example is San Fernando. In fact, I have actual example. I won't give the exact address of the property because certainly I want to respect persons' right to privacy. But I do have, for example, a property on Danford Street in Marabella. Currently, they're paying a tax of $5,320. That's for residential. They'll be paying $1,798, and that is a significant reduction in the tax. And the reason for that is because persons living in San Fernando, the municipal area of San Fernando, are paying a property tax, residential tax, 8% on 2004 value. So based on evaluation, and there are many other examples. I have the example of someone living on Maconi Street in Gulfview. Currently, they pay $12,096. With the new tax, they'll be paying $4,082, a significant drop. So it is not everyone is going to see an increase in the tax. And you must remember too, John, you are talking about persons paying a tax based on a valuation done as far back as 1940 to 1960.
Okay. Now, in terms of that as well, I understand it has been calculated on what is called the rentable value of the property. Now, some people may say, I am not renting my property. I have no intentions of doing so. Why do I have to pay the tax based on this rental value of my property? How does that apply to people like that who pay mortgages, for example, monthly?
Yes. Now, you have to understand valuations as an expertise, as a specialty area. There are persons who are trained as valuators. And in order to do that, they must determine some kind of formula in which they can determine what rate of tax that will be fair and equitable and transparent. And so my understanding is there are two choices. You could have used the capital value of the property, or you could use the imputed, meaning that what you would have gotten as rent for that particular property. But it is used as a basis for creating a formula. So whether or not you actually rent the property or you are not going to rent the property at all, it is the basis for working out the formula. So in other words, you had a choice. Do we use the capital value, which I know will be significantly more, because if you have a property, for example, worth $5 million or $2 million or $1 million, obviously that amount is going to be larger, that capital value, as opposed to what you would rent it for on a monthly basis. So it is really a mechanism that is used by the valuators to be able to work out the base upon which they would determine your tax. Now, we have been focusing on residential, but we must remember there are other categories. There is commercial, there's industrial and agriculture. And for each one, there's a different rate. But again, they're using a formula. I believe when it comes to agriculture, there's a difference in the formula, but certainly for commercial and residential, it is what is the imputed rental value, meaning if you're renting it, clearly we know what it is, so you don't have to impute it. But for those not territories, for those residences that are not actually rented, you have to use some basis for determining the rental value.
You know, Minister, a lot of concerns have been expressed by people on fixed incomes. For example, you know, I've, for example, met a lot of old people saying, you know, I am a pensioner and so on, and their worries about forfeiture possibly down the road. How do you allay those fears and those concerns?
John, if you don't mind me just going back a little bit on what I just spoke to, because I know I gave out how we assess it, but I think sometimes people ask you, well, they want to have an actual example. So if you don't mind indulging me, and I would then move on to that. For example, when we said imputed rental value. So for example, if you're living in, let's say, Port of Spain, or let's say in San Fernando, any part of the country, rural part of the country, the evaluators who are experts and trained in the area would say, looking at the area of the property, the condition of the property, and all those other factors, they, let us say they determine that you would rent it for, say, $2,000 a month. All right? So how do you work it out now? So you say $2,000 a month. Now remember, it's the annual rental value. So it's 2,000 multiplied by 12 months, which will give you 24,000. So that gives you a base. Now, because they take into account that you may have a month in which you may not rent your property, they take out what they take out at 10% for everyone. So if you're taking out the 10% for everyone, you're looking at $24,000 minus $2,400. And therefore, you're coming to a figure of $21,600. That's how you do it. Multiply by the 12 months and take away 10% of that gross figure, and you end up with $21,600. Now, having arrived at that, you then use the same rate regardless of where you are located, which is the 3%. So 3% of that gives you $648, and that's $648 for the entire year. Now, you asked me about persons on fixed incomes and so on. I want to get away from, let's just focusing on fixed income, because as someone reminded me, they know someone on a fixed income of $20,000 a month. So we don't want to focus on the fixed income, but I know what you mean to say. You mean that if you're on a fixed income, there is the tendency to believe that a person is experiencing financial hardship. But the test is not the fixed income, the test is financial hardship, because you may not be on a fixed income and be experiencing financial hardship. And the other thing may be true. So it's a test of financial hardship. And you know, one of the things that people, we're not focusing on, this is reform. Why do we say it's reform? Because the current land and building taxes legislation that obtains now makes no provision, does not acknowledge circumstances where persons are in financial hardship. None at all. In fact, the current legislation says that the only circumstance when they will take cognizance of anything is in cases where your property has been destroyed by fire or flood or act of God, as it says. This legislation is a legislation